There was once an old woman called Silverhair, and her family had thrown her out, and her friends had thrown her out, and her whole community had rejected her and chased her out of the town and out of her home into the forest. And there she wandered for days and nights, becoming wearied and desolate. One morning, as she was carrying on her journey, she came across a house, and she looked at it and thought, perhaps this can be my shelter. I really need to rest. And as she approached, she thought, well, there might be people in there. I better just have a look. And so she peeped in at the window. And at the window, she saw a beautiful table with 3 places set, with steaming bowls of porridge and lovely chairs with cushions and a cozy house. And she thought, oh, that looks so nice. I wish I could go in there. And she looked around and she didn't see any sign of anybody at all. And then she peeped through the keyhole to see the other part of the house. And again, she just saw a cozy house with no one there. She thought, I'll just see if the door's open. And she opened the latch and it opened and she walked in. And inside it was warm and cozy, and she sat down. The smell of the porridge was delicious. She hadn't eaten for days. She hadn't sat down in a soft chair for days. She sat down in the first chair, and that chair made her back hurt. It wasn't good for her. And she thought, no, I won't sit on that one. She tried the next chair, and that chair was so soft and low, she couldn't feel comfortable there either. And then on the smaller chair, she felt perfect. It was just right. So right, she didn't even feel the chair there. She just felt deep comfort. And then she thought, oh, I'll just rest for a bit and catch my breath in this lovely soft chair. And then she was so hungry. And she thought, I'll just try some of the porridge. Just try a bit, they won't notice. So at first she tried some from the big bowl. But the spoon was just the wrong size for her mouth, and the porridge was so hot and it had too much salt in it or something. She didn't like that one. She tried the next bowl, and that bowl was just so sweet of porridge and so milky. Just she couldn't actually eat it. She didn't like it. And then she sat down at the third place and she had a taste of that porridge, and oh, it was absolutely just right. The temperature, the texture, the taste, everything about it was just perfect, just right. And she sat down and she ate one spoonful, and then she thought, oh, just wait, maybe one more. I'm so hungry. And actually, she just couldn't help herself. She just ate the whole bowl. She looked around the house with relief and thought, oh, if only I could just sleep for a bit on a soft bed. And so up the stairs, she just couldn't resist going upstairs and seeing what was there. And there were 3 little bedrooms, and she went in the first bedroom and she thought, oh, I'm going to try this bed. But she couldn't even get up onto the bed. It was so high up. She thought, oh, this is stressful. I'm going to go and try the other bed. And in the middle room, the bed was so soft, the mattress just kind of swooped down and made her feel really unsupported. She thought, I can't sleep on this mattress. And then she went to the third mattress and she lay down on it, and oh, it was perfect. It was just right. Her body just melded into the mattress in a way so it didn't even feel like there was a mattress there. It was just so right, so perfect, and she fell into a deep, deep sleep. In the meantime, the owners of the house, which were 3 bears, had been taking a nice morning walk in their forest whilst their porridge had cooled down because one of the bears had made it too hot. They were chatting and enjoying the morning forest, and they came back ready to have their hearty breakfast, and one by one they entered into the house. And the first bear sat down in his chair, and it felt strange. It was like rickety and had kind of like faced a different way. He thought, someone's been on my chair. And then the middle bear sat down on his chair, and his chair, the cushion was on the floor. He was like, why is the cushion on the floor? I don't understand that. Someone's been on my chair. And then the third bear, who was a bit smaller, looked at their chair, and actually their chair had fallen down on the ground, or maybe knocked over. And the bear thought, I didn't knock over my chair. Someone's been in my chair. And they were so hungry, they thought, well, let's just deal with it after breakfast. And they sat down at their tables. And the first bear noticed that the spoon was actually like in the porridge, not by the plate. And they were like, who's been eating my porridge? And then the middle bear was like, actually, there's a whole spoon been taken out of my porridge, I can tell. And then the smaller third bear looked at his plate and there was no porridge left at all. Suddenly they began to be extremely nervous and extremely suspicious, thinking, who has been in our house? Who's been sitting on our chairs? Who's been eating our porridge? And they rushed upstairs into the bedroom. And the bigger bear looked at his bed and saw that the sheets had been ruffled. And the middle bear looked at their bed and saw that his sheets had been, pillows had been fallen off onto the floor. And then they went into the last small bear's bedroom. And who should they find but an old woman asleep in the smaller bear's bed? And they were furious, and they all looked round her, about to say, wake up, when Silverhair, the old woman who had been thrown out of her home, woke up with a start to see these three bears looming down on her. And she got such a shock, she woke up, and before you could say anything, she had jumped out of the window, never to be seen again. So that story you might recognise as a variation on the Goldilocks story. Well, actually, that's the original Goldilocks story. The original Goldilocks fairy tale was actually based on a tale called Silverhair. And the Goldilocks character, who was then called Silverhair, was an old woman who had, like I told, had been ostracized from her community and sent as a kind of vagrant into the forest, like an exile. And she comes across the house, and the whole story goes as if in the Goldilocks story. You might know a different one there are lots of different endings too, but I thought it was interesting to tell that story as it was in the original, because I found it quite shocking that this was actually a tale of an older woman. And actually, when you look at the text, the way the older woman is described is actually so upsetting that I actually found it quite distressing even thinking about making this video, because it's just a string of really quite appalling, offensive, misogynist words. You know, she's called like a dirty, repulsive, abject, hag, all these appalling misogynist words heaped onto this character called Silverhair. You know, she's considered a criminal, she's considered grasping, disgusting, and outcast. And Silverhair is met by these bears, and you'll notice that the way I told the bear story was not daddy bear, mummy bear, baby bear, like it was told. Perhaps you might have had that or told that to your children or been told that. In fact, in the original version, not only was Goldilocks Silverhair, but the three bears were just three bachelor bears. They were like all male, and they weren't like mummy, daddy, baby. That was something that was projected onto it much later. Probably around the same time that Silverhair got turned into Goldilocks. So there was a time in the, I think, 19th century when Silverhair was replaced by Goldilocks, an older woman, ostracized and, as I've said, heaped with insults, turned into the innocent little so-called orphan girl with golden locks. And that's how I received that as a child. The story was that there was this curly-haired blonde little girl who was wandering around in a forest, and I always thought, like, why? And it wasn't sort of clear what she was doing there. Was she running away? Was she lost? Something like that. Anyway, in that story, it's the little girl, and so straight away she's given this kind of innocence, and the point of changing Silverhair to Goldilocks was, according to the people that changed it in the 19th century, was that the little girl with blonde hair would have more appeal to children. So I just, and also in some of those variants, there was, the ending was different. So there were some which tried to make the ending a bit happier, like, and Goldilocks was so sorry and said she'd be a good girl and lived happily ever after with the bears. That was one. But the one that I remember and that I was told was actually that she jumped out the window when she woke up and saw all of these bears, and it was like a kind of narrow escape. She woke up thinking, oh my God, you know, I'm a trespasser, I'm an intruder, I ate their porridge, I broke their chair, I slept in this bed, and now they're here in their beds and I'm going. She goes. So when it becomes Silverhair, the whole thing becomes quite different, doesn't it? The intruder becomes a demonized older woman, so it sort of has resonances to the kind of witch character, doesn't it? The sort of punishable, exiled outsider, who's been rejected from her community and is in this liminal space of the woods where you know, where transformations can happen. And then there appears this house, again, a kind of home sweet home type house with all the idyllic associations with hot porridge and soft chairs and beds, which is a real draw and allure for the person that's a wanderer and an exile. But in fact, with Silverhair, she's an intruder. And with Goldilocks, she's an intruder too. There is this sense of the intruder, the trespasser, the one that breaks in, either the older woman, Silverhair, or the younger girl, Goldilocks. It's a break-in. And then it's also a transgression in terms of eating other people's food, sleeping on their beds, kind of intruding into their sort of intimate surroundings. There's a kind of uncanniness around the fact that the bears are on the inside and the human is on the outside. And I loved that as a child, the way in which the story positions the non-humans as inside the domestic space, with the rituals of breakfast, lunch and dinner and chairs and beds and walks and that sort of way of having everyday life. And the human is the wild one outside, you know, living in the forest, with no rituals of everyday civilized life and no beds, food and chairs. So I loved the way the outsider was positioned as the human, and then these bears, which are supposed to be wild and scary, are the ones on the inside. And so we become frightened of the human. And in this case, in the Silverhair case, of the older woman being the intruder, the transgressor, the repugnant, as she is described in the early versions of this tale. When she makes her transformation to Goldilocks, she becomes less abjected. But it's very interesting to see the mechanism that happened of a very, very overtly violent misogyny towards this older woman in the language that she's described in, and how that gets transferred or turned into its opposite. So she becomes a little girl. So silver turns to gold and old turns to young. It's a complete and absolute reversal from Silverhair to Goldilocks. And what I think's intriguing about that is that the sort of violence in that tale against the older woman, against Silverhair, is hidden, but embedded, because I've always found that tale creepy and sort of slightly uncanny and a bit strange. It's something about the fear and the desire and excitement about breaking in and not knowing that someone's going to be there, together with this switch of the bears on the inside and the humans on the outside. And her sort of, in a sense, her kind of transgressive bravery to go into this, what she wants to be a haven, but it's really not hers to be part of, because again, this is a tale of not belonging and exile. And when she falls into this sleep, it's always interesting when people wake up in stories. It's like waking up. It's a transformation, isn't it? And so when she wakes up and she sees these three pairs of eyes, of bear eyes, furious and angry, accusing her, about to accuse her. You broke my chair, you ate my porridge, you lay on my bed, and you're not supposed to be here anyway. And who are you, you intruder? Are you a threat? But before they've even able to have a conversation, she makes a narrow escape and jumps out of the window. And as the tale says, no one ever heard from her again. So off she goes into the forest. What I think is particularly disturbing and important here is to unearth this mechanism which has happened sort of invisibly, where Silverhair turns into Goldilocks. And what we see is the number 3 that is very key in this tale, the 3 bears, which also is associated with the 3 little pigs in the, I think, in that fairy tale, which I'll come to in a different video, because that's also about an intruder, isn't it? And that's the wolf as the intruder. This is the old woman as the intruder, but then the old woman turned into little girl as intruder. It's really strange. That's why it didn't really work either when I read it, because the little girl, Goldilocks, with her little golden bright hair and, you know, small child, isn't really a threat, is she? But the tale has this sense that the bears are, you know, outraged by this intruder who they then sort of get angry with, and she jumps out of the window. It makes much more sense if it's an older woman, by definition, in exile from a culture that doesn't recognize her place. And the repetition of 3 is really interesting. Not just the 3 bears, but the way in which the tale repeats 3 times. You know, there's the porridge, the chair, and the bed before the climax of the tale. It's a big trope in fairy tales, you must have noticed. But what I think that relates to here is the 3 fates. So remember, in early Greek philosophy and myth, there's this notion of the three fates. Sometimes they're thought of as 3 sisters, but they're actually 3 old women representing birth, life, and death. And they're supposed to, in the myth, appear 3 days after any child is born in order to kind of work out the fate of that person. So the first fate is to do with the birthing of the person. The second fate is actually, it's called spinning, I think. And then to draw out. So the first fate is to spin the fate. The second fate is her job is to draw out the thread. And the third fate, called Atropos, is to cut, which is the bringer of death. So it's all about time, isn't it? This 3. So this repetition of 3, it's like beginning, middle, end, birth, life, death. The 3 is, well, that could be a whole another rich chapter to think about in relation to number 3s in myths and fairy tales. But in this particular fairy tale, it's very interesting that there's an old woman hidden, in a sense, behind the young girl, the silver hair transmuted to the Goldilocks. So what's locked? What gold is locked into this story? For me, it's a hugely important mechanism that the disgust that the fairy tale in its original form heaps upon the figure of the old woman, to then, a century after or more, to be transmuted into a little girl, Goldilocks. And so that when generations of children or people are hearing this, they don't remember or know Silverhair, they just know Goldilocks. But something in that myth embeds this hidden older woman that was the original intruder. And it just is interesting the way that disgust that was heaped onto the older woman, what happens to it? It gets switched into an idealized version of a shining girl. So the older woman gets infantilized and made into a little innocent girl, sort of idealized, which is the mechanism that happens all of the time in sort of the representation of women in fairy tales. So what I'm trying to say is it's a brilliant example of how Goldilocks and Silverhair are the same thing in a way, that the little girl is actually the older woman, and the repugnant sort of fantasies projected onto older women in these fairy tales are hidden but exude out through this mechanism of infantilizing her and making her Goldilocks. So let's think about the intruder in fairy tales. I'm going to come back to make another video about the 3 little pigs, because I think it really relates to the 3 the 3 bears in this story. But all I want to say is that the next time you hear Goldilocks, just think to yourself, actually it's Silverhair. And Silverhair, the older woman, has been pushed out and ostracized into the forest to then be scared off by these three bears. And what does it mean to have the bears on the inside being threatened by the old woman, who then has to jump out of the window and become, in her future life, Goldilocks. And therefore, Silverhair really is never seen again, because Goldilocks takes her place and hides the latent misogyny in that fairy tale of hatred heaped upon the older woman. So let's bring back those three fates, the older women that spin our fates. And let's say to Goldilocks, who jumped out of the window in fear of the bear's retaliation, go well, Goldilocks, go well, Silverhair, into the forest, wherever you are, because really you don't want to be in that house at all.